Welcome to the Continuing Education module, Integrating Disability Management Benefits, Rationalizing and Managing Employee Absence. Our agenda for this particular module includes the following topics. We're going to be looking at perspective on integrated disability management, IDM, key insights, benefits of IDM, requirements, comparisons, a case study of IDM, expanding our look at injury prevention issues, website and resources, and a summary of key points. Let's first look at a perspective on integrated disability management. And our definition is IDM is a unified and consistent approach to an employer's disability benefits program, including absence management, short-term disability, long-term disability, workers' compensation, and Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, claims and cases. One of the things that's important for us in the area of integrated disability management is to understand and know what the economics of worker health are. And this is data that's been taken from several articles combined. It's a look at the national. It's been updated using the Mercer Employer Survey results to 2015 dollars. And it basically says for presenteeism, about $19,000 of presenteeism loss during an individual's year of employment on average. And what that means is there's about 24 symptom events for each of us, each employee that's an adult per year, and many of those affect and take away from our productivity at work. So that's the Collins article on the Dow Chemical assessment of presenteeism related costs. 13,000 is our health plan cost, and that's essentially from an updated survey of employers in the U.S. It's probably a little low for 2015, but it's in the ballpark. Next area is sick leave, and that's where we're going to focus some of our IDM interest and emphasis. The next area is our workers' comp cost at $873, and then about $1,400 for disability, and that includes both short-term disability and long-term disability. About 2% or so of a workforce usually experiences disability. It's more likely to be in larger organizations because they oftentimes have the benefit that allows people to remain employed if they in fact are out on leave due to an injury or illness that's not work related. So one of the things that's important for us to recognize is that each company, each organization has its own cost profile. This is a national cost profile. It's best for you to look at your own organization's profile and set up the means of being able to track that if you are interested in wellness and its effect on integrated disability management. The total of all of that is about $37,000 per employee per year. And that's really part of our benefit cost. It also affects the presenteeism portion of losses that occur in our compensation package. If we think of total comp as salary and wages, plus all our benefit costs, which include required, legally required benefits, as well as those that are provided at the option or discretion of the employer, then we're looking at a loss right now on a national level, on average, for each employee of about $37,000 of value. A major portion of that is in our health plan costs. But another major issue is our presenteeism related loss, or losses due to the fact that I go to work with some underlying medical or health symptoms, and that affects how productive I can be at work. Now let's look at the benefits of an integrated disability management approach. And first of all, a reduction in overall costs associated with employee accident or illness. So we're looking at cost reduction at one end. And then another issue is the improved productivity. Another is improved data management. Another is improved claims management processes. Another is the reduction in fraud and abuse. And also the modified return to work, or improvements in the way return to work operates. In addition, some of the benefits of IDM also include the ability for the employee to feel better about the employer when they recognize how supportive the benefit structure is to unplanned or unknown illnesses and or injuries which may prevent them from working. And finally, an emphasis on the employee health and wellness of the individual in terms of how they are experiencing their own health and well-being. Why don't more organizations do integrated disability management? And over the years, the reasons that I oftentimes find people say they don't and don't want to look at this issue, sometimes it's an interdepartmental turf issue. Meaning that the people who are recognizing the need aren't in control of the areas that they have to work on in order to accomplish IDM. Secondly, and a lack of credible cost data to make the case. So frequently that cost data is buried in the financial records of an organization and not necessarily brought to a visible point by management fiat or by those that are tasked with managing the particular areas of employee benefits. Another one of the issues is just lack of vision. Sometimes they don't understand what those benefits are. They're in the weeds in terms of the benefit details, don't want to get down in the weeds. Therefore, they lack the vision to see how those benefits can in fact be integrated. And another reason is that management attitudes limit applicability. So oftentimes management is not looking at the benefit related or employee side of things. They're watching either stock prices or share prices or equity or mergers or acquisitions, but their attention is elsewhere. And oftentimes there's an overfocus on workers' compensation. If workers' compensation has been an issue for cost or for productivity effects in the past, oftentimes that leads up to an overfocus on workers' compensation and ignoring essentially the disability management or disability insurance related issues of an organization. And finally, a lack of strategic benefit awareness, recognizing and not recognizing what different generational groups have and look at in terms of what they value, and being able to look more strategically rather than tactically at the benefits that are offered employees. So these are some of the reasons that I've found that organizations don't often do an integrated disability management approach. Now, what does an IDM approach require? And first of all, you have to have senior management support. So senior management has to essentially identify the need for this. There needs to be some sort of single cross-functional team that can look at the different pieces and components and essentially reconfigure them. There needs to be some common objectives and claims processes about the information which comes out of each of these potential areas of benefit, and then how these can be used in the process of improvement and integration. There usually needs to be some protocols the same for work and non-work related causes. So it has to do with how we in fact look at whether something is work related or non-work related and how it's handled in terms of how the employees are treated and what the benefits are. There also needs to be some formal data joint systems. So the ability for us to look at the way in which that data comes from the variety of areas that deal with absence of employees. There also needs to be a fairly strong employee communication program, or the wellness program needs to be able to take some responsibility for educating employees about the benefits that they have, particularly around absences that may not be work related, those outside of the workers' compensation arena. And there needs to be some sort of annual evaluation process. So those are the things which I have found IDM requires in terms of how an employer might go about putting in place an IDM approach for its employees. Now let's look at paid time off as an absence management strategy and some of the implications of that. And one of the issues is that many employers have dedicated leave by category. So they may have holidays, they may have vacation days, they may have personal leave, they may have administrative leave, they may have sick leave. And what happens in a paid time off or combined leave system is that those days are essentially reduced in total number and then essentially turned into annual leave days. And then regardless of the reason for the leave, there's a certain amount of leave that people can use. And then that paid time off becomes the main way that the employees experience time away from work that is paid for. Now, one of the issues that comes into play in a PTO approach, one of its implications is all of a sudden, I as an employee have more incentive for me to prevent some of those common self-limiting colds and flu and other kinds of problems that I oftentimes experience. That's 24 times a year, according to the National Health Survey. The average American employee or worker experiences some sort of personal medical symptom. So twice a month on average, we usually either take the issue in and we'll go to work anyway, or we decide to stay off. Sometimes we seek medical attention. Sometimes we might use WebMD.com to look at symptom checker, to look at its significance. So there's lots of things that are happening that get created by the combination of various types of leave into a kind of common paid time off or annual leave arrangement. And the implication there is that all of a sudden employees want to know more about medical self-care. And they will usually want to know, how do I prevent some of these reoccurring problems? And what can I do to take better care of myself and improve my well-being so that I don't need to use that paid time off for sick leave? It kind of becomes a waste to me in that sense. So those are some of the implications that come along with paid time off as an approach to what we have historically considered as dedicated sick leave. Now, a brief comparison between the traditional sick leave programs, which are often used for family illness or personal business. Days are tracked separately from other time off programs such as sick leave. So those traditional ways in which we look at things. The sick leave plan usually pays 100% of pre-disability income, creating no incentive to return to work. Sick leave offers no economic benefit unless it is utilized or unless an employer has some sort of carryover provision, which allows the sick leave days to be taken in payment, either full or partial payment, at the end of someone's employment. Now, the problem with that kind of approach is that it usually creates what's called an unfunded liability. It's a liability that's on the books, and you encounter it when the employee chooses to retire or to quit. So that's what creates some of the problems from people's efforts earlier to create more of an incentive for people not to use their sick leave. Now, under a paid time off system, the employee advocacy program moves management of time to employees. It eliminates sick leave abuse. The economic incentive is to not use days rather than use sick leave days. It rewards employees who do not use sick time. It is relatively easy to administer. It can eliminate potential gaps in disability coverage if integrated with short-term disability plans, and that's what we're going to deal with when we deal with the examples of the IDM. And in addition, it also creates more of an incentive for people to learn how to take better care of themselves. So that's an important element that comes along with the paid time off. On the disadvantage side, we potentially lose our ability to track sick leave. So we can't look at the wellness program's effect on sick leave, which has been documented very well in the literature. So about 25% of sick leave usage is eliminated by the traditional wellness program. And we do, though, we can, if we are using any kind of survey devices, ask people to and or keep track of when people take paid time off with less than a 24-hour or 48-hour period of time between the request for use of the days and the actual days and their use. And that is what's called an unscheduled leave method for getting at a sense of how much sick leave is going on in the population. And it's a proxy measure that if we use the same rules and we repeat the same rules over time, we can in fact evaluate the patterns and trends for the use of those unscheduled leave days or short scheduled leave. So those are some of the ways around some of the difficulties of moving from traditional sick leave, which allow us to count those days and to value them in an econometric way versus a paid time off kind of approach. Now, let's look at an integrated disability management case study. Let's start with a typical traditional approach where the employer provides a range of different types of days: vacation, personal, birthday, sick days, and you can see the numbers here arrayed in a typical pattern. Holidays, 7 holidays, and what happens basically in this traditional approach is we have segmented or delineated leave. And so this is where we get into the problems of using sick days and the incentives that exist for those and so on, unfunded liabilities and those kinds of issues. The typical traditional pattern is for the employer not to provide short-term disability. It's a more rare benefit. It's unfortunately rare. The long-term disability is oftentimes what's provided, and it oftentimes has an elimination period where the individual has to be out of work and not receiving pay for 90 days before the disability program or coverage cuts in. The benefit is often 60% of salary up to $10,000 per month. That's a typical kind of trigger or threshold on controlling exposure in this kind of benefit. But the idea also is that frequently people are not, their disability payment is considered and not taxed. So the ability for us to have a lower than our salary amount. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that might come up in an integrated disability approach where you are really providing an incentive for people to take better care of their own health and well-being. In this particular part of the example, we're just kind of saying, in addition to that delineated leave arrangement we saw on the previous slide, there's also the lack of coverage for short-term disability and the provision of long-term disability, but with an elimination period that's a fairly significant amount of time. And that means that for 90 days, the individual has to exist financially without any additional payment of wage or salary during that time period. And that means that, by the way, that there's very few people that are in the workforce that have emergency set-asides that would cover 3 months of their salary. So you can kind of appreciate the dilemma that we have when we use this more traditional approach to providing kind of the long-term disability coverage. Now let's look at a proposed IDM approach. If we were to start with the traditional structure of benefits that you've seen in the last several slides, the PTO replaces personal, birthday, vacation, and sick days. That's our designated types of leave. So paid time off just puts it all into one pool. The holidays are determined by the company. They're not included in PTO. The same eligibility waiting periods and accruals apply for this PTO. It allows employees to carry over unused PTO up to a certain limit. But our recommendation is that you have a maximum that forces people to actually take the vacation days. So the ability to use or lose is actually something that you help and want the people to take that time off. That's what allows them to step back from work and have better well-being in terms of their own pursuits. Also, executives can be deemed to be in a higher years of service category, so you can disconnect the name of the years of service and the amounts. So you could use some qualitative names that would allow them to use and have a higher number of days. And that's oftentimes what you're using to recruit executive staff. So that's how you would take care of that. You use the first with long absences. So the ability for you to use long absences and use these paid time off days first is what's required. The schedule can be anything that the company sets up. So it can be based on previous experience. It can be based on taking your previous pattern of use of days and actually using some sort of prorated reduction of those. You generally are going to have fewer days than what you have as all possible days, because you don't want to start with put your threshold or your ceiling up too high to start with. So you may take maybe the average of all types of leave has been 22 days per person per year. You might start out by having that average be more in the area of 14 or 16. And that's where some of the efficiency or the increased value to the employer comes from in how you structure that conversion to PTO. So that's a proposal related to an IDM approach that we're going to look at in more depth as we then progress through the next series of slides. Now, the coordinated short-term disability component, and short-term disability usually includes up to 60 days of short-term disability coverage. It can go longer depending on the type of coverage pattern and what's being written in terms of this insured business. And the eligibility, the proposed short-term disability plan replaces a traditional sick leave plan. So the eligibility is all employees after 6 months of employment have this provision now come into play. The wait period starts after the 8th consecutive calendar day of disability after the PTO. And it could be, for instance, work days or calendar days, depending on how you wanted to structure it. But the idea is you don't have to wait 90 days, which is what the long-term care or long-term disability management provisions if you had only that long-term policy. So the maximum duration of benefits for this might be 90 days. So 8 days from the time that you are not able to work, this benefit then starts to kick in. And the benefit can be also related to the percent of salary. So we have tax-free in many jurisdictions, so that can be a lower amount, which can then provide an incentive for tenure, for longer duration of involvement as employees. So that's something that can enhance that by having a differential percent of benefits that would be your benefit if you triggered this short-term disability kind of provision. You also have periodic contact required, because if you don't have that, then the person essentially goes off, and the longer they're on leave, the more likely it is they will be on leave permanently. So you also could have a medical exam requirement for the individual to continue their coverage or to move from short-term to long-term. So those are prudent measures to help you reduce fraud and abuse, and at the same time create a better financial situation for the employee. So this, again, the proposed short-term STD policy would start after a period of time of employment. You then would have an 8 consecutive calendar days and or work days of disability. The maximum duration of benefits can be 90 days under this STD policy, and then it can have a differential percentage of salary as the benefit. But it also should have some accountability around contact and around medical exam requirements. The coordinated LTD component is enforced from the 91st day to the 730th day, 2 years. This provides the individual time to qualify for Social Security disability coverage if in fact their disability is a permanent situation. So it does not put all of that on to the employer, but it basically says you have 2 years. If you are still disabled at the end of that 2-year period, then you need to be applying for Social Security disability coverage. So the eligibility, again, would come into play after a certain number of months of employment. The wait period would go from the 91st day, which is at the end of that 90 days of short-term disability. It would go from that day to the 730th or 2-year period. Maximum duration of benefits, 2 years. Again, the percentage of salary that the benefit provides can be geared back to the amount of length of service. So that's another way to reinforce it. It's similar to what we saw in the approach on short-term disability. And periodic contact is required, medical exam requirement is possible, periodic clinical reports are required. So we basically don't want people just dropping out of work, being on a STD policy or LTD policy, and having nothing to do with our work environment. The more that we don't have that involvement, the more likely it is that they will move into a permanent disability or a Social Security disability for whatever the problem is that they're facing. So this again would be the coordinated LTD component of an IDM approach. Now, as we look at the traditional versus the proposed IDM plan, you can see that under the current time off and disability program, you have a period of time where sick leave is providing 100% of the financial benefit to the individual, making up for their wage and salary losses for not being there. So that's paid time. And then the gap right now is a 90-day period, and that's the lack of a short-term disability policy. And then the long-term disability policy picks up and goes up until the 2-year period, and then at perhaps a higher rate. So that's 60%. Maximum coverage gap is 90 calendar days. Under the proposed IDM approach, you would essentially have the paid time off covering those days up to the 8, and then on from that 40 to 60%. And if you actually had the PTO time approach, whatever absence was due to a health-related issue would be covered in the use of your paid time off. So you could say essentially that the last 8 days of your PTO were used in a way that would be that would really start the clock, so to speak. And then 40 to 60% coverage, that short-term disability policy kicks in, and then the long-term disability policy kicks in. So the maximum coverage gap would be 8 calendar days. And the reason that we suggest this is that very few employees have sufficient financial resources that are liquid that could make up for a loss of work for one of the two major spouses, the spouse or the employee. So the ability for most families not to have a lot of financial resources puts a great deal of stress and pressure on the individual. So what that ends up being, according to the American Psychological Association in their annual health and well-being surveys of employees, has found that personal financial issues, particularly around work-related illness and injury, or work that affects their working capability, is one of the points of high stress for most employees in the U.S. So what you're doing here is you're reducing stress by being able to restructure the benefits into an integrated approach that allows the individual to feel more comfortable looking at the possibility of not being able to work for whatever issue or reason. Now, let's go a little deeper into the 4 spheres of injury prevention. So if we think about working populations, we can kind of break them down into work-related injury prevention, home-related injury prevention, play-related injury prevention or recreation, and then driving or vehicular activities where you're going and traveling. So those are the 4 areas, and we're going to look a little deeper at each one of these. First of all, on the work site, conditions involved in time away from work in the order of their frequency, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics 2016. The first most frequent is sprains and strains, bruises or contusions. And by the way, sprains and strains has a lot to do with the resistance, the strength that an individual has, the flexibility that they have or don't have, and the aerobic capacity, more so those first two than the last one. And then bruises or contusions, and that's oftentimes coming in contact with something which creates a bruise or a contusion, cuts and lacerations, fractures, multiple traumatic injuries, and that's more the fall situation or injury related to falls, burns from heat, carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, chemical burns, and amputations. Those are the conditions involved in time away from work in terms of overall magnitude. So it just says that the most number of lost work days is at the top of the list, and then the second most, third most, and so on. So these are the reasons why people are not at work due to work-related kinds of illnesses and injuries. Now let's look at some home-related injury prevention activities. Ladder accidents are a very common home injury. It oftentimes shows up in the major diagnostic category in the reporting of claims data around injuries and illnesses and accidents. And ladder accidents are fairly typical, and that's where we essentially lose our balance, fall off the ladder, break a bone, or sustain a fracture or dislocation. But those ladder accidents are fairly common, and they oftentimes are seasonal in nature because they have to do with removing leaves from gutters, prior to the kind of the winter and those kinds of issues. Falls are a major issue in terms of home injuries, shocks, burns, lacerations, poisoning, lawnmower accidents, where we are essentially hit by a flying object, or where the tip of our finger gets hit by the blade when you're removing grass from the sides of a exhaust area in a lawnmower, stings from insects, and then finally contusions, which are just abrasions and or the crush type injuries where you don't break a bone, but it damages the soft tissue. So these are going to be the common injuries related to home safety. And a home safety kind of effort will generally reduce these kinds of occurrences. These oftentimes show up in the major diagnostic category of reporting on claims that has to do with illness and injuries and accidents and injury cost. So that's where this oftentimes shows up. In addition, these kinds of injuries from home settings can also lead to short-term disability and long-term disability. So these again are some of the areas where we can focus an injury prevention effort on a home setting as one of the ways in which we try to get at this particular area of risk-taking and behavior. Let's look now at vehicular related injury and injury prevention. And some of the issues that come into play here are automobile accidents. That's the #1 cause of short-term disability usage in the US. So that's a major issue. Defensive driving would be one of our ways of being able to get at that. But it also involves a number of other strategies. The National Safety Council, which we'll look at some resources in a little bit, is one of the sources to be able to deal with that particular issue. The use of safety restraints when we're involved in any kind of vehicle, seat belts, and chest restraints. Those are torso related, kinds of restraints. Those are things that would apply in a vehicular safety situation. What happens when we have a breakdown? Do we have, as our automobile has a problem, are we prepared to deal with that? Maybe in terms of severe weather conditions, or maybe in terms of safely getting off of highways and being able to deal with breakdowns of automobile breakdowns. So those are issues around that. Intoxication is another major issue. The DUI, kind of phenomena for employees. Personal safety has to do with how safe are you when you park your car in an urban parking lot? and how can you safeguard yourself a little better around that. So that's the behavioral elements, the informational elements around that. Distracted driving is also an important issue because that's something we probably ought to be doing something actively about. It's a major problem for us. It's involved in a lot of automobile injury situations and personal damage and property damage situations. So it's the idea of what are we doing when we're driving? How do we reduce that distracted driving? So in summary, these are some of the major issues that come into play in this particular area of injury prevention that we call vehicular injury prevention. Now let's look at recreational or play-related kinds of issues. First of all, our general risk-taking behavior. So we have extreme sports, we have extreme risk-taking in terms of many of the things that are recreational in nature. We have the issue of physical conditioning about getting ready for snowmobile season or getting ready for ski season or our beach activities or surfing or whatever it is. But there's physical conditioning. There's equipment adequacy. So that's the issue of how and what kind of equipment do we have that we work with in terms of recreational pursuits. Weather preparedness. So the issues of how do you prepare to make sure that you're safe when weather changes radically, and when you're maybe in mountain situations and you have a blizzard that occurs, and those are weather preparedness. Animal hazards are the issues around both things like rabies and being able to affect the various kinds of other infectious disease conditions that are part of our concerns around our exposure with animals, both domestic animals as well as wild animals. Plant hazards would be another issue. Insect hazards, backup plans, those are all part of the recreational kinds of activities. So those also lead into some experiential kinds of issues as well. That experience is oftentimes related to where are you getting your training when you start to do a new activity that has risk in it. I had a good friend when I was working with the Department of Health and Human Services that really liked he started off being a climber. So he really had to go with people that showed him how to climb, do rock climbing safely. So the experience level kind of pursuit. And lastly, present moment thinking, that's PMT. And that basically is applicable to virtually any kind of activity, and it's where we watch carefully what our thinking is doing. Are we daydreaming about something else? Are we involved in something that's risky, but our mind is not on what we're doing? So PMT is a general strategy that safety and safety-oriented individuals do in fact think about, is how do they use present moment thinking in all these different situations to help people be safer in their pursuits. Now, some websites and resources around these areas. First of all, you can go to cdc.gov, NIOSH, and you will have and find lots of things on work-related safety. You can go to the National Safety Council.org and find a whole series of resources around all three of the other domains of safety and injury prevention. And if you want to look at them individually, you just put the home in that, and then use EHC and workplace, and you will find a lot of resources and a lot of issues discussed on the National Safety Council website. The Journal of Safety Research can be looked upon and for various articles that have to do with the level of risk in different industries, as well as how various kinds of safety research has shown to affect injury occurrence. There's also Injury Facts. That's an annual publication put out on a national level. There's Estimating the Cost of articles and unintentional injuries and other kinds of things. That gives us more of the economics of injuries. The Health US 2015, now 2016, gives a great deal of information around injury and illness, illnesses that are secondary to things that happen in the worksite and happen out of the worksite. The CDC.gov, National Center for Health Statistics, and the Health Information, or Health US, is a series of informational issues that address injuries across the country. So these are some of the websites and resources that you can use to help get a better handle on the injury prevention aspects of a wellness or well-being effort. Now let's summarize key points. And the first one is all companies need an integrated disability approach. It really is not an optional thing when you come down to the effects of injury and the inability to work and how that affects family units. So all companies need to have some attention on the integration of the disability management. IDM needs to integrate well with wellness, particularly in a health and productivity management style wellness program, what we call results-driven wellness approach. An IDM should improve the financial protection for employees and their families against health and injury risk. So that financial protection is one of the things that we're attempting to do. It's also absence management and IDM need clear contact and notification triggers. So we can't leave the information in a sense buried. It needs to be brought to the surface in order for the integrated elements to operate. Wellness probably needs to utilize a more robust set of virtual interventions linked to IDM. So in terms of the future of wellness, I think a lot of our more virtual-oriented interventions, the technology infrastructure that we've talked about, should in fact be used to support this particular area. PTO, or paid time off, helps align employer and employee health and wellness incentives. So it actually is a good thing for us to be supporting and using. Wellness will need to evolve over time to address a much broader range of issues in the IDM area, particularly around injury prevention. Since injuries are a major cost for U.S. employers, whether they're at work in the workers' comp area, or sick leave, or the effects on a PTO system, or the disruption in productivity that occurs when someone is out of work for any length of time, in addition to disability, short-term disability, long-term disability, FMLA Leave Act, so Family Medical Leave Act at the federal level. That's an unpaid benefit, but it also creates some long-term liability in terms of having to leave a job open while someone in fact is on FMLA leave. So it definitely has resource implications for employers. And those Family Medical Leave Act leaves are in fact related to many of the issues that come up under injury prevention when we look at the four major domains, particularly the three that have to do with home injury prevention, vehicular injury prevention, and recreational injury prevention. A number of potential integrated disability management and wellness program and integration points are identifiable. So there are a number of places where we can connect the various issues around these areas. A number of program metric strategies need to support the effort. So there are metrics that really come out of short-term disability, long-term disability, PTO systems, unscheduled leave issues, FMLA, all the variety of reasons that people are oftentimes in a non-work capacity. And integrated disability management approach also enhances work-life balance for a workforce. So we in fact can add to the work-life balance issues if we're careful about how we've structured the various absence-related benefits that are designed to protect our employees from the financial liability and strains of not being able to work. So that's a summary of the key points from this particular. Now let's look at some key questions for this module. How can an integrated disability management project or approach be sold to senior management? And one of the ways is to do a scenario example where you take maybe over the last year you've had a number of disability management situations where people have been out of work for a length of time. You could essentially say, here's how it is currently, and here's how it might be if we were to use this kind of integrated disability approach, and to use that as an opportunity to put this process, make it visible, and hopefully get senior management to say, yeah, we really ought to update our benefits and upgrade them. And then to update the need for that rationalization. So identifying the fact that the benefits may in fact have assumptions about our employees' ability to sustain being away from work for a long period of time. Many of the surveys that I've seen in the financial wellness area have an indication that as high as 85% of employees do not have sufficient financial resources to be out of work for 4 weeks. So we've got a very high percentage of people that are very vulnerable financially. Their families are vulnerable, and we really haven't really done anything to help reduce that source of stress and that potential adverse effect of not having the financial resources to cover those absences from work. We can also use the issue of balancing the recruitment retention effects with the cost of the benefit. So if we want to use a redesigned integrated disability management approach to help improve recruitment of new employees and retention of existing employees, and then we're going to add some cost related to that, then we're balancing those things out. If we are achieving more efficiencies and actually having lower cost expected, then that becomes the issue that we position the IDM approach with senior management about. We also want to support our wellness initiative. So that would be another approach to being able to sell the IDM kind of approach to senior management. Second question is, how is integrated disability management likely to affect employee opinions? And I think it's only going to affect employee opinions if we educate and inform people about the change. So that means that we have to be able to educate them about what their current benefits are and what the problems with those are and what the new benefits do to eliminate those problems. And then we also want to be and have them support and be supported in terms of the financial wellness aspect. So that's another way in which it's likely to affect employee opinions, is if we are addressing financial wellness and we're talking about the fact that everybody needs an emergency fund that is highly liquid that can actually meet the needs if they were, for instance, prevented from working for a month or 6 weeks, that would be a way in which their opinions would be affected by an IDM approach. It also can help recognize the realities of their own financial situations and the fact that they may really not have sufficient resources to be able to sustain any kind of work health related issue. And then I think it's likely to help their perceptions of their employer. So if their employer is doing integrated disability management and actually telling employees about the changes that they're introducing and the value of those to them, the utility to them, then it's likely to help improve the perception of employees of their employer. The third question we want to address is, how should IDM be evaluated? And I think that the best ways of evaluating an IDM approach are, one, to look at a financial effect on the organization and on the individual employee pre and post. So that may involve some likely scenarios. It may involve being able to compare what happened in a pre-sense with the post sense. It also can include satisfaction levels with the benefit. So we can in fact look at what people are saying. Sometimes we use a Likert scale and we ask people to strongly agree or agree with a particular statement, and the statement might be, I feel much better, or I feel much less stress around my personal finances now that we have modified our disability insurance benefits. And then ask them to strongly agree, those that strongly agree and those that agree. And then over time, you might then ask and look at the percentage of all of the respondents that answer with those two responses. That would be an example of a question that could be used to look at satisfaction pre and post, and to deal with a change over time in that when we educate people or maybe have more of a financial wellness aspect covered in our wellness program. We can also use a number of other survey questions that can either test their knowledge or test their understanding of their benefits. And we can then provide some feedback to all employees based on the responses that come out of those kinds of surveys. So those are some of the more common ways of being able to evaluate an integrated disability management kind of approach. We can also look at the number of days that are paid or the number of days that are not paid that are lost from a situation pre and a situation post. So it's another kind of approach to evaluation. Now you've completed this module, so go ahead and take the quiz.